Good evening and welcome to Tadaima 2023. My name is Rob Buscher and I'm the online film festival curator. It's my great pleasure to be joined here by the cast and crew of Amache Rose, the short documentary film about the Amache Rose. So at this point, we'd love to get the conversation started by having each of our panelists self-introduce themselves. If you could tell me your name, the role in the film that you played, and where are you currently based, or where are you calling from today? And in my case, I'm based in Philadelphia, but calling from my parents' house in Bethel, Connecticut. Bonnie, would you like to start?
Sure. My name's Bonnie Clark. I am a professor at the University of Denver in the anthropology department. And a lot of my research on the gardens at Amache is sort of featured in the Amache Rose. And also it was my archaeology crews back in 2012 who first discovered that we had some extant roses growing at the camp.
Hi, I'm Carlene Tanigoshi Tinker. I'm a Amache survivor, and I was privileged to be a volunteer for the Amache Field School directed by Bonnie Clark, and also privileged to be included in the movie Amache Rose. I guess because I was there, I could tell personal stories about the rose and what it meant to me. I currently live in Fresno, California, and I'm a retired high school educator and administrator.
Thanks.
Professional gardener. My background is in Japanese gardens, and I've been working with Bonnie in the field school since 2016. And I was interviewed for this film to talk about just kind of my background with gardens and about the roses. So, and I'm currently in Santa Barbara, California.
Thanks. Billy?
I'm Billy. I'm the director of the film. I'm based out of Denver, Colorado.
Great. Well, now that we know a little bit about each of you, can we talk about how the film actually came about? I'm always kind of curious how these types of stories originate. I mean, it almost seems too perfect in the way that the rose blooms at the end of the film, and what an incredible, genuine reaction from everyone that was there at that moment. But I'd love to hear more about the origins of the film and how you all became involved in this project.
Yeah, so I can start there. So the film was produced through the Denver Botanic Gardens and the program that I had up there, the Denver the Denver Botanic Films. Sorry, I don't know why I'm flubbing my words there. And I was looking for a long time for a story to tell when one of my coworkers came up and pitched this idea to me about Amache, because he had met Dr. Clark just at their community garden, and they got to talking. And I was just lucky enough to be the person with the camera that had the ability to tell the story. And then I met all of these wonderful people, and they were willing to make this movie.
So I guess then it seems that you were all sort of involved in this from the inception then. But I'm kind of curious, like where did the idea for the film come about? Was it just part of this ongoing series of the Botanic Films?
Yeah, so this Denver Botanic Films is a department within the Denver Botanic Gardens where we are producing our own documentaries. This is the first. I'm now working on the third. And the idea actually came from Anthony Meluso, who's the producer on the film. And he came to me and told me this story. And I had been tasked with starting Denver Botanic Films and been looking for a story to tell for a while when he came to me and pitched this. And immediately I jumped on board and thought, yeah, we need to make a film about this. And I didn't know too much of the direction that we would go until I met Bonnie and Greg and Carlene actually down at the field school. And we got down there and I started filming. And then I realized, okay, we need to go even a little bit further with this. And I ended up doing a trip out to do interviews with both Greg and Carlene in California as well. And then went back down and filmed a couple more times down in Amache with Dr. Clark. And it all just sort of came together.
Well, since we're talking about the field survey, maybe we could talk a little bit more about the Amache project at University of Denver and the work that you're doing there, Bonnie. First off, how long have you been involved in the Amache project, and what is the current state of the project?
So it actually started a really long time ago. In 2005, I started to talk to local residents who are the caretakers of the site and the museum, as well as Amache survivors, to see if somebody doing archaeology down there would be a welcome intervention. And as a professor, it seemed of archaeology, it was an amazing opportunity, I thought, to be able to do work, to teach my students how to do a kind of archaeology that's really responsive to the community. And that would really make a difference as the site was becoming, because it was just starting. I got involved just as it became a National Historic Landmark. So this was when, the thought that it might be a park was a long ways off. And so we started this community engaged work, and we're really so fortunate to have folks like Carlene and Greg who wanted to come and be volunteers and work with us alongside college students. And then we also, and there's a few of them in the film as well, we have some high school volunteers and interns who work with us as well. So we've got crews of all ages. And it's been, we're, hoping that we're going to go back in 2024. I just finished writing my grant, so keep your fingers crossed for me. But it's been really well supported by the Colorado archaeology community and now by the National Park Service. And so we, the work that we're doing is very methodical. And so we go block by block, and we really are walking back and forth. And we're looking for gardens, certainly, and we find a lot of them, but we're also identifying, the little pieces of people's lives that they've, threw away or dropped along the way. And we mark all of that down. And that information is really, I think, important for the proper management of the site. But we really do think that these, the botanical remains and the remains that are related to gardens and the living trees and the living roses and other plants are just a really amazing legacy.
Yeah, and what an incredible resource for the camp and for the entire community of descendants and survivors to be able to have an archaeology program that works in hand in this capacity. But I'm kind of curious, aside from the rose, obviously, what are some of the most interesting finds that you've had?
Well, I'm going to actually pass the baton off to Greg to talk about there is an amazing tree out there.
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, there's one of the blocks that Bonnie likes to take people to. Actually, in the same block is where the roses are. And I was talking to one of the other volunteers about a technique that I was taught by one of my masters about, bending the branch back into the trunk. Which, if you talk to people, kind of basic tree, arboriculture 101 is. Anything going back into the trunk is, that's a no-no. Like you don't ever do that. You cut that out. But what I was taught is when you have a tree and you're trying to compact the space, right? So you have a tree that wants to be 20 feet wide, but you have a 10-foot space. Well, how do you get that tree to fit into that space? And one of the techniques that I was taught is that you bend the branch back into the trunk, but then you eventually bend it back out and you create a zigzag pattern. Right. And that way you can compress a line. And I happened to be talking to one of the other volunteers about that technique. She was asking me about pruning. And then the next day we went out to that site. And I was looking at this tree that was laying on the ground. It had died and it was just the stump. But I noticed, was like, oh, wait, there's an example of that technique right there, which, somebody had bent the branch back. But because they were there for 3 years, he didn't have time to continue the pattern and continue his design. And so you can see where the branch, then the tree just went back to its natural growth pattern, and it went just straight up. But that's probably one of the, telling Bonnie, I mean, to find evidence, like physical evidence of human interaction on a tree like that 80 years later it's kind of mind blowing and pretty unbelievable.
It is quite remarkable. And for the specificity of that technique, I think it must have been pretty special for you to be able to see that there.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, I know that both you, Greg, and Carlene are based in California. So how often do you get to go to the Amache site, and how long actually are these surveys that you're going out on with Bonnie and her program?
Well, let's see. I met Bonnie and her grad students in Las Vegas in 2009, the year after they started the Amache Field School, which started in 2008. And I've been a volunteer every 2 years after that. And so next year, if I make it, it'll be my 8th time. Typically, the school runs for 5 weeks. I think we cut it back a week, didn't we, Bonnie, to 4. But it's an amazing survey, if you want to think of it. You start with actually surveying the block that you're interested in. You flag little artifacts that you think are significant. So that goes on for 2 weeks. Also, there's aerial photographs that are taken. There are instrument intervention. In other words, you want to make sure there's nothing underneath the surface that is important. And so they do, typically in the second week, they use an instrument called ground penetration radar, which sends radio waves down. And then Bonnie and her crew analyze the data, and they see if there are wavy lines and bumps and all those kinds of things. That's important. Then the third and fourth week, after they have decided which block, which barrack, which site that they want to investigate, to excavate, then we start digging, not foot by foot, but inch by inch. And that goes on for the third and fourth week. And hopefully they have captured what they had intended to capture. And I've done the survey part, but it's not as exciting for me to do that anymore. So I always go for the excavating. I want to see, I want to get what's down there.
Well, and Carlene's an ace at the screen. So we have her show other folks how to make sure they don't overlook anything that's important.
Yeah. I will say Bonnie and her crew and her staff have been very fortunate to have Amache as their research site. No humans have lived there since 1945, which makes it ideal. What researcher has that available to them? It's pristine. The only living things that have walked there, cows, snakes, deer, ground squirrels, whatever. But anyway, she's very lucky. And what she has gotten out of that is, I mean, that's pure results. Those are the things that a researcher wants to get.
So Carlene, as a Amache survivor, what is it like for you to be spending so much time at the site? Of course, many people go back for pilgrimages, but it's usually 1-2 days at most, and you're there for weeks at a time.
Yeah. Well, honestly, when I first met Bonnie, I had no intention of really even signing up. But being a front row type, and she's got this little meeting going, she says, I'm looking for volunteers. So yeah, okay. So I hadn't been there since 1945. So I was just going as an interested person, not as somebody who had felt nostalgic, felt a connection, that kind of thing. But when we got there, I think it was the second week, Bonnie had somebody from a TV station in Denver who was interviewing me, and the crew, Bonnie and I, walked up to my barrack, and I said, Bonnie, I have no idea. I have no idea where I lived. And she said, well, they're over there. I said, well, it's just grass. I'm expecting a building. Yeah, right. So anyway, she points to the door, and I said, "Oh, okay." So in the meantime, the cameras are rolling, the kids are laughing, and all that kind of thing. And I go in, and I stand there. I said, "Bonnie, doesn't mean anything to me." But within a few minutes, all of a sudden, I could remember where my parents stayed. Quote, the bedroom created by a blanket thrown over a rope. And then I said, "Oh, there's a single light bulb." And Bonnie said, "Well, how did you keep warm?" I said, "Oh, over there. There's the potbelly stove." My God, I couldn't believe it. So I came out and I said, "Bonnie, that's incredible. I had no idea." And then Annie, one of the crew chiefs, said, I said, "Well, Annie, how did I remember that?" And she said, "Well, your memories are like an onion. Think of it. The outer leaves of that onion bulb are your recent memories. But as you peel them back layer by layer, down in the core, that's where your memories of Amache are." I said, "That is totally amazing." So that had me hooked. Every year when we find something that's relevant to me, I got to come back. And that's why I've been 7 times and why I'm going to be there for the 8th time.
Well, that is incredible, and thank you for sharing that story with us. I can't imagine, what that must be for you to have those sort of experiences, and so great that you're able to continue telling these stories.
Yeah.
And I guess Greg too, like as an Amache descendant, what has it been like for you working at that site?
It's really been interesting because for me, I really knew nothing about Amache before I started volunteering out there. I kind of heard some little bits and pieces. My grandfather had kind of done an oral history with one of my uncles, but he pretty much stopped when he got into Amache. He said it was just too painful to remember. So it's really been fascinating just to stand in the in the barracks where both my parents were housed, and it's definitely it's been a life-changing experience for sure.
Yeah, I can imagine. So we did have a question from the audience. This comes from James Okamura. At Manzanar, there are remains of garden water features. Are there any remains of gardens at Amache? And of course, we did see a number of those mentioned in the film. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what does exist there that's identifiable.
So so a lot of the gardens don't look like much from the surface. They seem to have maybe not as much access to concrete for like ponds and things at Amache. And I know it is the high desert and water was at a premium. But we do have some pond features, and actually we excavated an amazing pond that we think was probably at least sometimes had running water and was more like a waterfall at Amache just this last summer. It was at a mess hall. And we do have some karasansui, some dry gardens. There are some gardens that appear to be made entirely of cactus. And then a lot of gardens that are really at these interesting hybrids. So they might have trees planted, but then they're also using concrete that they've stood up and in place of stones. And those concrete pieces, so many of them are actually leftovers from the pouring of the barracks. Because at Amache, the barracks were a concrete outline. And so when they put the molds in, sometimes with the sand, it would sort of squish out the bottom. Or at the end of the day, somebody might, they just would dump out the last of the concrete. And then those people are using that as stepping stones in the gardens. So it's amazing how they are really looking at these cast off materials and finding the beauty in them. And that was a lot. The pond that we dug this last year was amazing because it was basically, they had glued together all of these different, stones that were left over from construction. And we do have, again, a number of living trees. The vast majority of them are Siberian elms. But we do have a couple of others. We're going to work at a block this year that has a 2-story tall juniper. I think it might be a Rocky Mountain juniper that somebody got from the foothills and transplanted down there. So, we have a wide variety. The local bedrock is limestone, and it was exposed in a couple of the features that the WRA made, including where they stored the coal. And so that limestone then gets used a lot in gardens as well. So it gets used as sort of a lot of limestone outlines of gardens. And we find lots of trees that still have kind of degrading limestone rings around them. And ringing your trees like that would have helped to keep the moisture in when you watered them. And they clearly did a pretty good job that so many of the trees have survived, all these years later with, only 3 years of care before they left.
Yeah, that is incredible. And I think it's a good segue into a conversation more about garden practice in general in the camps, and particularly at Amache. There was a quote in the film, and I can't remember if it was you, Bonnie, who said this, but the idea that creating gardens was a means of survival and ability to endure. And this kind of idea that both, I think the gardens themselves are a testament to that, but then also to the Japanese American community to endure this unendurable experience of the wartime incarceration. And just hearing you talk a little bit about some of the found materials that were being sourced in the creation of these gardens, it really strikes me that in some ways, there is this sort of similarity to traditional Japanese garden practice, right? And that idea of, it's integrating the materials that are available in the natural site, and something that's unnatural in this particular case, like poured concrete, or the stone that has been excavated by the WRA, creating space for the coal bay, then become part of these garden features that have helped to kind of shape what that made landscape is looking like. Really fascinating to me. But I guess maybe from the perspective of some of the practicing gardeners here, to some extent it seems like there was some traditional Japanese garden technique being used here, but in the film it's also explored that there's Western garden technique and maybe a hybridization of these based on what was available and what wasn't. But if anyone could talk a little bit more to the sort of the diversity of the gardens that were at Amache.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about that. One of the biggest things that basically, if you were a professional gardener in Japan, you would start as a teenager as an apprentice, and then you'd work your way up, and that would be pretty much your life path. Most of the guys that were, the first and second generation that were building gardens, they were bootstrap gardeners. Like, they had no formal training, and so they just, they created what their conception of a Japanese garden was, really. Some of them, obviously came from Japan, but others were, second generation, and, maybe they just had, some ideas. But, Kendall Brown talks about he calls the Japanese gardens in the United States, he calls them Japanese American gardens. And, a lot of for that reason is that, that most of these guys were bootstrap gardeners. They didn't have that formal training. Because if you were formally trained in Japan, it's like, there's one way of doing things, and that's how you do it. You don't veer from that path. There's a saying in Japan that the nail that sticks up gets hammered down, and so there's, that tradition, just, you don't veer from, from what your master taught you. And so, I think, that's, and we see that in the diversity of the gardens. There's definitely, like one of the gardens where we found that tree that I was talking about earlier, there's another feature in that garden that Bonnie and their crew found previously, that there was also a cedar plank walkway that went out about 10 feet out the front door, and then they built a stone wall. And that's basically a tea garden technique, right? Because as you walk out, it forces you to pause, and then you have to make a choice whether to go left or right. You can't just continue on your way going forward. And what that does is that, that's a technique to create mindfulness. That it's like, okay, you're walking out the door, but then you have to pause and you have to think. And so, to me, like that, that technique along with that, like the same, in that same doorway is where that tree was developed. Those are really high level Japanese garden techniques. That's not something that a bootstrap gardener is gonna figure out. So that person, to me says, okay, this guy had some formal training. But a lot of the other gardens, that we're finding out there, yeah, there's definitely aspects of, of Japanese gardens, but there's also, you can tell that, it's also somewhat of an interpretation. And it doesn't have, some of the formality that you'd find in.
And some of them look, for all the world, kind of like an American front yard. You got a little fence and you got a few plants and you got a little bench to sit on. And but I agree with you. This idea of making the most of what the like seeing the beauty in these sort of cast off things. It's really deep, practice that I think helps us think back to the roots of the Japanese gardens, not just in, some of, our more famous Zen gardens, but these are like Shinto, in terms of kind of honoring the spirit of things and seeing their beauty. And that's where I see that, when you can see the beauty in something thrown away and use it in your garden, that's part of why it's healthy for you, right? And that they're in this situation where their country has turned its back on them, and yet they're seeing, like, they see this value. And I was actually really inspired in my analysis of these gardens and thinking about that in terms of modern day prison gardens and the way that prisons help people create a more healthy relationship to time, and how, and in a prison, they talk specifically about how composting is a very powerful, it's not just a powerful practice, but it's a powerful metaphor. And that's one of the other things that's very, often surprising to people, is just how much they invested in this soil. So there's a lot of composting of various different materials. There's the soil chemistry that we do is often, there's so much more nutrients in the soil than in the normal, but it's a pretty poor sandy soil. And so in order for them to be able to grow these beautiful things, they were really working hard at amending that soil. And this is, again, these techniques that these folks who come in who are farmers, there are lots and lots of, there are more farmers at Amache than there are professional gardeners. And so they are also, they know techniques of water management and soil construction, and we see that legacy there.
So based on what you're just saying about the soil composition and the sort of water management, I can maybe hazard a guess at this, but we have another audience question from Mitch Homma. Many of the living trees at Amache are from the incarcerees. Can the panelists talk about how they were planted?
Yes, so I actually was really lucky. I got to do an oral history with a gentleman whose family had run a nursery before the war, a kind of backyard nursery in the kind of greater Los Angeles area. And he told me that when they went, and so a lot of the trees were actually purchased from a nursery. And his brother insisted that they give them peat moss so that they would be able to plant that with the tree to give the tree, more organic materials and to have a better chance. And they really chose Siberian elms because they are so hardy, and they kind of knew that when they would, once they took, that they would be, that they would thrive. But that also, again, the putting the stone circles around the trees, I think also helped. We have some indication that they were staked, and given that it's a really windy out there, then that would have also helped them survive. And we see that staking in some historic photographs too. But some shrubs and trees were, so Amache is 3 miles away from the Arkansas River, and people went down to the Arkansas and they dug up saplings down there. And those were mostly cottonwoods, but also some of the shrubbery, more shrubby stuff down there. we're starting to think that that's probably where they found the roses too, that they transplanted wild roses. And so those things that come up from the Arkansas, because it's down there by the river, it's a little more clay soil and it has more organics. And so the soil itself would have been a good amendment to put in with those trees. But the cottonwoods did not, they need a lot of water. And for the most part, they did not, don't seem to have survived long after people were there. But they definitely, the incarcerees were definitely thinking about how to make these plants, how to have the transplants do well. And people do remember, young boys in particular, that watering the trees was their job.
It's also fascinating because, you know, we have heard about garden practice at other camps, but at least from this film, it seems like Amache is sort of an exceptional place where there seemed to be more gardens than some of the other camps. I don't know if anyone has done a survey of the other camps to the extent that they would be able to say whether that's true. I also know that many of the other camps were in harsher desert climates, which may not have been as hospitable to some of the plants that we're talking about here. But just curious if anyone here in the panel could comment on how Amache compares to the other camps in terms of the garden practice.
Well, I will say I stole the concept that Amache is Colorado's largest, and again, all apologies to the Denver Botanic Gardens, that Amache is Colorado's largest Japanese garden. And I stole that straight from Kendall Brown, who used it to describe Manzanar. So Manzanar does have lots and lots of gardens, and their gardens, they had lots of like really well-known garden designers and landscape architects. And so they have lots of really kind of big, flashy gardens, more so than some that we have. And they had, access. They were going and digging up, big Joshua trees and things like that, and transplanting some of those plants. And they had actual stone that they could get from the mountains. But so there's lots and lots of gardens at Manzanar, and there's some recent research done by an archaeologist who's a descendant at Gila River, who's talked about the gardens there. I think maybe it's that we just have at Amache and Manzanar, we have good enough there, like other things haven't happened for us to not be able to see them. So I suspect that they were very common. And when you look at the photographs, I think they're common everywhere. It's hard in Gila River because they didn't maybe have as much transplant, but they did a lot of ponds. And those ponds would then evaporate up and help cool people's barracks. So I think the gardens change depending on where they are, but I think they're pretty common in all of them. And, they're also gardening even in the assembly centers. So even before they leave, and then, they know they're not going to be there very long, and yet they're also gardening there. So I think it tells us just how strong that urge to garden was in this community.
Yeah, I can see it would certainly be something to help not just pass the time, but really to make it a more livable place. I'm curious, Greg, as a gardener yourself, has this work that you've been a part of at the site impacted your own practice in any way?
That's a tough question. Most of my work is doing actual pruning. So, it's I guess it somewhat changed my perspective on Japanese gardens. A lot of people are very traditionalist and, feel like there's this, you have to have these authentic Japanese gardens. But I think a lot of what we're seeing out there, it's a Japanese American garden. It's not a straight, copy of, what you see in Japan. And so I think that's probably been influential for me as far as my perspective on Japanese gardens.
Yeah, thanks for that. And then Carlene, before we started the live stream, you were talking a little bit about the roses that were transplanted from the Amache Rose. Maybe you could share that anecdote with our audience here. I understand that you all took a small clipping from the plant and brought it back to your homes.
Oh, you mean the fact that we got clippings? Is that what you're saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thanks to Billy when he came out to interview us. A gift from him was 2 little clippings of the rose. Okay, at that time we didn't know how precious it was, or they were. It turned out that the correct me if I'm wrong, Billy. Didn't Mike Bone, your horticulturist, clip about 250 clippings?
Yeah, about 100, 150. Yeah.
Yeah. And how many survived?
I think only probably about 50 to 60, maybe.
Yeah. So at the time, I didn't know how precious they were. But nonetheless, I thought, oh my gosh, I am not one to garden. And I proved that by not making my clippings grow. But I planted them. And guess what? They grew, and they grew, and they grew, and they grew. And that's because I live in the Central Valley where, we're the capital, the agricultural capital of the United States, so they say. But anyway, the climate here was very conducive to their surviving. And I think the tallest one got to be over 5 feet tall. And so I guess it was April, that was when we first saw it bloom. Nobody had seen them bloom. Our clippings. When did yours bloom, Greg? Was it in April?
Mine were a little bit later, like maybe May,
May?
June. Yeah.
Yeah, Steve Archer, who's the botanist, archaeobotanist for Bonnie's crew, he lives in Maryland, and his clippings bloom first. So I was in San Francisco, and I could hardly wait to get home to see what was going to happen to mine. And lo and behold, a couple of days later, mine started blooming, and Bonnie had me take a diary every day. I was out there at 5 a.m. taking pictures of these plants, and they bloomed for about 2 weeks. So anyway, thank you, Billy, for the gift, and they're still doing very well. As I said, I'm taking the second crop of clippings, and hopefully I'll be a little better about making them survive.
Yeah, it seems like everybody has been able to get the roses to bloom except the Denver Botanic Gardens. The whole idea when we were making the film was that we were going to try and get these roses to bloom at the Denver Botanic Gardens, and that would sort of be the end of the film. And it sort of worked out that they didn't bloom. We still haven't gotten them to bloom at the gardens. And so when it came time, we were like, okay, we got to figure out an ending to this film. So we went down to the pilgrimage, and lo and behold, that's where where we saw the first bloom. And it was a better ending than we could have asked for, a better ending than we could have asked for, or even just having them bloom at our own gardens. It meant so much. And then once that first bloom happened, they started blooming all over the place with Carlene's and Greg's but everybody but us.
Well, and this last year so that was the pilgrimage in 2022. And, as the film points out, it was so meaningful. Well, partly because we were all hoping that we would get to see it bloom, was that it was the first pilgrimage after COVID, and that we'd had our first in-person pilgrimage for 2 years. And it was also right after the Historic Site Act had passed. So one of the reasons that we went out there was that the National Park Service folks had wanted to see the rose. So I was taking them out to see it. And that's when we realized that's the time it blooms, is in May. And because we're normally there in June and July, and it's too hot. And so it was, of course, very, very moving to get to see it bloom. But then this last year, we went back for the pilgrimage in 2023, and it was blooming again. And so Carlene and I are saying that, whatever its species is, we think its subspecies should be pilgrimage. So it's the Rosa Arkansas pilgrimage.
Yeah, for so long we thought that the incarcerees had brought them the clippings from California, but yeah, when Bonnie took us out there, we said, no, they brought them from the river, which was, how far were we from Grenada? Only an hour, mile and a half or something like that.
Yeah, we were not very far. I mean, you can see so where we found a big, like just a big giant wild patch of these roses that are very, very similar and were blooming at the same time. You can look up the hill and see the water tower at Amache. So it's that close, a couple of miles away.
Yeah.
So, and it makes sense to me because so one of the things when we do the archaeology is that we take a lot of soil samples, and some of them we take and we send for pollen analysis. And so we have gotten rose pollen from a number of gardens, but never have seen any living plants except in this one. And it makes sense to me that if these roses had survived, obviously these roses survived for 80 years with no care, is that it makes a lot of more sense to me that they are actually a local wild rose. And so there is the other name for it is the prairie rose, but again, the Arkansas River runs right near the camp, and it's Rosa Arkansas. So that's my going theory. And apparently we could spend a bunch of money and do some DNA analysis. So maybe we'll do that at some point.
Yeah, I know, Billy. What was the species that you chose? I can't remember. It was
Woodside?
Yeah, woodii. Yeah, which is where woodii. I found a very similar looking rose just to the west of the camp by about 2 hours. And my wife and I were hiking, and we saw these roses that looked extraordinarily similar in color. And when identifying roses, I guess one of the main things that it's used to identify is the spacing of the thorns on the rose, and the abundance of thorns and the length of they really use the thorns as one of the main things that they use to visually identify. And these were very, very similar, to the point that I'm not a botanist in any way, but I took some cuttings and put them in a Ziploc bag and brought them to the gardens. And they said that it looked close, but they couldn't really tell just based upon the thorns. But that was a place where the Boy Scouts actually went camping. Is in that area, about a few hour or two to the west, just in it's the very first sort of forested area that you would get to if you took the train 1 or 2 stops to the west.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
Well, it was such an incredible way to really end the film. And I mean, as you all stated, there's no way you could have planned that. I mean, it's just incredible to the timing and the season being exactly when it was during the pilgrimage. But I guess, Billy, you mentioned earlier that you've been working on these other films through the Denver Botanical Film program. And how has this changed your approach to making the other films that you're working on as part of this series in any way?
It has a little bit. Yeah, it has, because it makes me. So this is the first actual film with my name on it as director and producer and all of the things. However, it's not really my first film, because I started a different film before Amache Rose, and then I ended up finishing that film after Amache Rose was finished and released. And that film was about the human connection with trees. And what I realized that I was missing once I finished the Amache Rose, what I realized that I was missing for the tree film is the human portion of it, and getting to work with these people here who are so amazing. Carlene and Bonnie and Greg and Min, just all so amazing in the film. And it really it's a story of a rose, but it's really a story of a people. So I realized for the tree film, the next film, that it's really missing. It was missing the human aspect of it, the personal stories. So I focused on that for the next film, and I'm already thinking about that same thing for that tree film is about to be released. It's doing the film festival circuit right now. I actually am going to be in Orlando next week for the Orlando Film Festival. So that'll be released at the Gardens soon. And I'm already filming. I'm actually in Rome right now filming the next film. And I'm already thinking about that, looking for those special people that can be in the film. Not just the story, but the special people.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable because I think a lot of the films that are included in Tadaima, both this year and in previous years, focus on this idea of place-based storytelling. Mm-hmm. And it really is about the people and their individual voices and their stories. And we understand that these places are impactful and important, but then by understanding the lasting effect that they have on the survivors and also the descendants, what significance that they continue to bring to all of our lives, really, as part of this community. And I guess along those lines, it's exciting that Amache is now a National Historic Site and has been given that designation by the Park Service. And we're all very glad that is sort of developing in the way that it is. And I guess also in the film, it seemed like the local responses are pretty positive to this and in general to the remembrance of this site, when that isn't necessarily the case in all of the locations that were former incarceration sites. So I'm just kind of curious if anyone can comment a little further on sort of the local history perspective and how are the communities in Grenada and elsewhere remembering this period of history?
Well, something that makes Amache different from the very beginning, and it was one of the things we talked about in terms of thinking about it as a park, was this unique relationship it has to the town of Grenada. So it was the Grenada Relocation Center, but that's why it became named Amache, because you had Grenada the town and the Grenada Center, and it was a problem with the post office even. And so the town has been connected to it, and they've owned the site, and they've been caretakers for a really long time. And people give a lot of credit, as they should, to a local teacher, John Hopper, who started teaching his kids about this history, and having him go out. They were going and gathering interviews, and they were helping people, look at their family collections that they had, and so that, I think, with the kids really feeling like this history at Amache was also their history. And they really embrace it and protect it. And I think that grassroots from the beginning is very different. And Carlene, do you want to talk about your work with John and why you support his work?
Oh gosh, well, you mean about my husband? And
mm-hmm.
Yeah, my husband and I visited Amache for the first time. I think it was 2004. And at that time, the camp was locked. I mean, there was a chain across the entrance, and we contacted the Lamar, what do you call it? Visitor Center. Anyway, they called John, and he was busy. He sent out one of his students, Antonio. And Antonio, here a senior in a very small school, I think K-12 is only about 200 kids, something like that. And I said, well, what do you have to do with Amache? Well, I belong to the Amache Preservation Society. Oh, what is that? He said, well, we're a group of students who work trying to maintain the campsite. We help Mr. Hopper, and our job is to start a museum. So he said, would you like to go see that? And I said, sure. Or we said, sure. So we go into town, and it's in the old building from which we have now moved. And all they had were card tables, a few artifacts, and little bins. And we said, oh, this is your museum? And he said, yeah, we're on our way. We're starting. And I said, well, let me see. And lo and behold, I was looking at this big binder, and I found my aunt and uncle's marriage license. Oh, wow. This is really good. well, Antonio, what are you planning to do? Well, I want to go to school. I want to go to art school. I said, well, that's great. Where would that be? In Lamar, which is only 20 miles away? He said, no, I want to go up to northern Colorado. And so then we realized, my husband and I realized that John Hopper was incredible. He had created these kids an atmosphere of investigation, of the importance of history, blah, blah, blah. And my husband was just agog. My husband was a professor, very interested in history. And so even though I went off to all of these field schools, John remained in the background in Fresno. He said, I'm not a researcher, I'm not an archaeologist, but I will support those kids. And so for years, he contributed financially to the Amache Preservation Society. And when he passed a few years ago, we decided to create a memorial scholarship in his name, which benefits specifically a senior Amache Preservation Society student. And so far, we have awarded 2 scholarships. The kids must demonstrate an interest in secondary education. That was very important to John. And so that is his legacy, hopefully. He wanted to support their work and how important it was, not only to themselves, but to the camp.
Well, and it's great that he can be remembered in that capacity. Yes. And what important work that was. Well, we are coming towards the end of our time here. So if anyone in the audience has questions, we invite you to ask them in the chat. We do have another one from James Okumura, who asks, have you worked with or are willing to work with other incarceration sites for similar botanical research? For example, share your expertise, experience, knowledge.
Well, I know that, I have, I often meet up with the archaeologist at Manzanar, and we kind of talk about what we're all doing. And I have been working with, like I said, that graduate student who was working at Gila River, but I'm certainly happy to share. And I will say we have trained students who have then gone on and worked at other sites and shared our sort of system with them in terms of how it is that we're doing it. But I certainly would love for there to be more widespread, kind of work like we have done, because again, I think these gardens are an amazing legacy from which we can learn all sorts of amazing things, both about the botanical world and the horticultural world, as well as the human world.
Yeah, absolutely. And what a poetic metaphor for the incarceration experience. As we're waiting to see if other folks have questions, maybe we could just kind of go around if you have any closing thoughts that this conversation had brought up for you about your experience with the site, about the experience in the actual filmmaking, maybe starting with Greg.
Yeah, I think just, I really appreciate the work that Billy did. I mean, I think he made an amazing film. And the, Denver Botanic Garden, the fact that they're, putting this out there for people to see, and they're not, trying to monetize it or anything like that, is really valuable to me too. So I just want to say thank you to all of them for the work that they've done.
No, I just want to say that I'm lucky to be able to work with all these amazing people, and that for the community aspect, this is reaching such a larger audience at the gardens, and being able to be on PBS, and it's really doing what I originally set out to do, which was. One of the reasons that I made this film is that I'm a very proud Coloradan, and I had no idea that this was that I had barely learned about Japanese incarceration. And I did not know until I was in my 20s that there was a camp in our state. And being a very proud Coloradan, that was very disappointing to me that that's not taught in our schools, and it's not talked about almost ever. And you'd be surprised how many people I talked to after seeing this film. And this film is being played at the gardens still 4 times a day for free to our visitors. And we're getting on average 15 to 20 people per showing. And even still, and we're getting still a lot of feedback. So it's reaching a very large audience, and it's spreading the word and uncovering the history that has been swept under the rug for so long, which is a very, very powerful thing, not only for people who are in the Japanese American community, I think, but for people who are not and don't know about it. They need to learn about it so that nothing like this ever happens again. And it's great to work for an institution that values something like that and allows that to happen.
Yeah, incredible work, really, and just incredible too to be able to see it through that lens. So thank you for that work, and thank you also to the Denver Botanical Gardens for continuing to fund projects like this.
Can I say a couple of things here?
Please.
Last couple of years, Bonnie's crew has come up with a theme that we put on our T-shirts, and it said, "Preserving yesterday's stories, stimulating dialogue today." And I think that is so provocative. I used that in a talk recently, and I shared a story with my friend. I showed her pictures of the Amache Rose, and she came up with an incredible greeting card that actually captured the meaning of that particular theme that was on our T-shirts. She talked about her father being a POW in a Japanese camp in in Indonesia, and comparing my interest or my internment in Amache. So it's been a wonderful ride. Thank you, Bonnie, for the opportunity to uncover my past, something I would never have done without you.
Well, thank you, Carlene. And it's just such an honor to work with Carlene and this whole community. And, I knew that day that we found those roses that it was something special, but it really, I will say, it really took Anthony and Billy and sort of that vision of the film. And we had always hoped that we would be able to propagate those roses, and I wanted to make sure, that they would live on in other places. And that was, that was a gift that the garden did. I was talking to Billy, and he's like, "I think I know some people who know how to do that." So, it's been this really amazing ride that's not over yet. So I just want to put so there is a garden here, a garden store, nursery, Tagawa Gardens in the greater Denver area. And they have it's an Amache descendant who is one of the leaders of that garden, and it was founded by people from Amache, and so they have some of the cuttings that the Denver Botanic Gardens kindly gave to them, and so we are hoping that they're doing a propagating program, and so that we can have more of the Amache roses out in the world that people can have and have that own piece of that legacy, particularly, important for survivors. But I get people from all over who would love to have their own Amache rose, because I think this story is so powerful.
Well, thank you for sharing that with us. And it seems like a fitting way to end our panel this evening. I'd like to thank all of our panelists again for participating in the Tadaima virtual pilgrimage. And to all of our audience members, thank you for joining us as well. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your virtual pilgrimage.